Last week, we talked about life in a medieval castle in order to give you inspiration for your own fantasy setting. In that video, we mostly focused on how it was to live there and slightly less on the most common rooms of a castle. So today, you will get insights into some of the places one would find inside a castle in order for you to let it inspire your own setting. If you're ready, then let's get into it. Hi guys, my name is Jesper and welcome to the Vein of Fantasy. This channel is all about giving you inspiration to master your craft and create fantasy that will truly immerse your audience. 2 weeks back, I had the interview with the guys from the World Builders Anvil podcast, so there is no question of the week to follow up on because of that. But I hope to see lots of responses and inputs on part 1 of this series, so I can cover that in next week's video. Instead, let's head directly into today's topic. While life in a castle was harsh by modern standards, it was still much better than life for the majority of people at this time. Last week we talked about how castles only had basic lavatories called garderobes, and in yet another video we also covered how lights were provided by candles or oil lamps, rarely by the sort of effective torches depicted in Hollywood films. I have placed a link right here on the screen in case you want to check out that video. Let's begin a tour around the medieval castle, and our first stop is at the kitchen. Throughout most of the Middle Ages, it was quite common that cooking took place in the middle of the main living area, the dining hall, to make efficient use of the heat. Towards the late Middle Ages, a separate kitchen area began to evolve due to the risks of fire, but also to keep smoke, odors, and the general bustle of the kitchen out of sight for the lord and any guests that might be visiting. Many basic variations of cooking utensils available today, such as frying pans, pots, kettles, waffle irons, already existed in the great households. There were also cranes with adjustable hooks so that pots and cauldrons could easily be swung away from the fire to keep them from burning or boiling over. In wealthy households, one of the most common tools was the mortar, since many medieval recipes called for food to be finely chopped, mashed, strained and seasoned either before or after cooking. This was based on a belief among physicians that the finer the consistency of food, the more effectively the body would absorb the nourishments and minerals. So the kitchen staff of huge noble or royal courts occasionally numbered in the hundreds. In mentioning the kitchen, we also need to consider the larder. A larder is a cooling area where food are stored prior to use. The essential qualities of a larder are that it should be as cool as possible, close to food preparation areas, and constructed so as to exclude flies and vermin. It should be easy to keep clean and equipped with shelves and cupboards appropriate to the food being stored. In the northern hemisphere, most houses would arrange to have their larder and kitchen on the north or east side of the house, because there it received the least amount of sun. Many larders have small unglazed windows with the window opening covered in a fine mesh, This allows free circulation of air without allowing flies to enter. And many larders have tiled or painted walls to simplify cleaning. The older versions of the larder, and especially those in larger houses, have hooks in the ceilings to hang meat from or game. Others have insulated containers for ice. Then we of course also have the gatehouses and guard rooms. A gatehouse is a fortified structure built over the gateway to the castle itself. Gatehouses made their first appearance in the early antiquity when it became necessary to protect the main entrance to a castle or to a town. And over time they evolved into complicated structures with many lines of defense. Strongly fortified gatehouses would normally include a drawbridge, one or more portcullios, arrow loops, and possibly even murder holes where stones would be dropped on attackers from above. Sometimes gatehouses form part of town fortifications, perhaps defending the passage of a bridge across a river or across a moat. And now where we are on the less pleasant subjects, or if you're like me, the most interesting ones, then let's also cover the castle dungeon and the oubliette. Many people imagine dungeons to be dank, dark and deep vaults below a castle where prisoners were held and where the unluckiest among them were tortured. However, this image doesn't really hold true. The castle dungeon evolved, strangely enough, from being a prison within the tallest, most secure tower of the castle. Dungeons weren't always underground. In fact, most castles built during the medieval or early medieval period, I should say, didn't truly have dungeons simply because it wasn't a particular common punishment to keep someone imprisoned in a confined space. Initially, prisoners were kept in towers, as these were considered to be the strongest parts of the castle and the areas which could be best defended if a prisoner wanted to escape or something like that. Eventually, these prisons began to be called castle dungeons. There was something worse than being thrown into the castle dungeon though, and that was the oubliette, or the forgotten room as it was also called. The oubliette was a tiny vertical shaft which was often only large enough for one individual to stand upright in. They wouldn't have been able to crouch or kneel or sit or perhaps even turn around in it. They would have been lowered into this shaft by a guard, and once they reached the bottom, the rope would have been taken back up and the trap door closed above them. Often this shaft would have been so deep that there would have been no way to reach up to the trapdoor above. In the oubliette, the prisoner would have been forced to remain standing in the dark until they were released, if that ever happened. It was, all in all, a truly horrible punishment. Throughout the medieval period, Christianity of the form currently in power was obligatory. The room in the castle called chapel was intended for prayer and used by all members of the castle household. It was usually close to the great hall and often built 2 stories high. The lord's family sat in the upper part and the servants occupied the lower part of the chapel to attend morning mass. The next stop on our tour is at the Dovecotes. This was In the best Game of Thrones style, the building intended to house pigeons and doves. Dovecotes may be square or circular, freestanding structures, or built into the end of a house or barn. They generally contain pigeonholes for the birds to nest, and pigeons and doves were important food source, and they were also kept for their eggs. In medieval Europe, the possession of a dovecote was a symbol of status and power, and it was actually regulated by law. So only nobles had this special privilege. Their location was chosen away from large trees that could house raptors and shielded from prevailing winds, and their construction obeyed a few safety rules. So tight access doors and smooth walls to prohibit the entry of climbing predators such as rats and weasels. And then the oldest dovecotes are the fortified dovecotes of Upper Egypt and the domed dovecotes of Iran. Dovecotes were built by the Romans, who seem to have introduced them to the Gaul. The presence of dovecotes is not noted in France before the Roman invasion of Gaul by Caesar. That we also covered in another video, which I've placed a link to it here on the screen as well for you. Let's finish off with cabinets or boudoirs. Heating the main rooms in large castles during winter was difficult, and small rooms were more comfortable. They also offered more privacy from servants and other household members. So a cabinet was one of such private rooms during early modern Europe, and would typically be furnished with books and works of arts, and sited adjacent to the Lord's bedchamber. Later on, in the late medieval period, such requirement for privacy was fulfilled by the solar, as we talked about last week in the first version of this series. Boudoirs was the lady's private bedroom, sitting room or dressing room. This term derived from the French verb bouder, I think that's how you say it, meaning to pout, because the room was seen as a pouting room. Historically, the boudoir formed part of the private suite of rooms of a lady for bathing and dressing adjacent to her bedchamber. In this was the female equivalent of the male cabinet, basically. In later periods, the boudoir was used as a private drawing room and was used for other activities such as embroidering or even entertaining intimate acquaintances. All right, if you will allow me to move our stop on this tour onto Patreon, because there's a link right here on the screen for Patreon and in the description field below. So go check it out if you will. I really appreciate all the support that I'm getting on Patreon. You are my main people, so thank you so much. It allows me to focus on producing better and better quality videos for you. I think that concludes our tour of the medieval castle. I know that I haven't covered every single detail here, probably far from it to be honest, but I think this two-part video series should be sufficient to give you a good feel of the medieval castle. However, if I did manage to forget something important, please just let me know in the comment section below. In fact, we could turn that into the question of the week, I guess. In your opinion, what is the most important or interesting part of the medieval castle? Let's use that as the question of the week. And please don't forget to hit the like button below if you like this two-part video series. So in writing, I am not only focusing on completing book 3 of the Keystone Bone trilogy, but I'm also in launch mode of my Twitter for Authors book, and at the same time I've begun writing the second edition of my fantasy mapmaking book. writing books is much harder than one might think, and fantasy map making was the first book I ever completed. And since I now have a few books under my belt, I felt I could do the subject better justice, so I decided to write a second edition. It's still in the early stages, but my aim is to have it done towards the end of the year. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and learn to master the craft of creating immersing fantasy worlds, settings, and characters. Stay safe out there and see you next Monday.